Hi, fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. Today we have a special guest, Katie, from Books and Things, and we just would like to discuss The Odd Women with you. We felt like making a non-spoilery version of our discussion on this channel, and you should check out Katie's channel for a spoilery version of our discussion. Thank you to everyone who's participated in the read-along with us. It's been a lot of fun.
So this is my second time reading The Odd Women, and this is your first time reading The Odd Women. So what did you think of it? I know you liked it, and I'm glad, but
I absolutely loved it. I thought it was a really great book and a very surprising Victorian book in that it was so different and modern, and it didn't feel quite like it was written in the Victorian period. But then, of course, there was so much about it that was still very Victorian as well.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because it is from the 1890s, so it is very late Victorian. So in a way, it is quite modern, like for the Victorian period. It's nearly 50 years on from Jane Eyre, so it is much later. But then actually, it's a similar time to Hardy and things like that, and it does feel very advanced. It's just occurred to me if this is a non-spoilery video, we should probably explain what The Odd Woman is about because people who are watching it might not have read it.
That's true. So The Odd Woman is about the Madden sisters in the late Victorian period and how after the death of their father, they struggle to navigate Victorian society. And in doing so, they meet a whole host of male and female characters who shape their journeys along the way.
So the sisters are all forced into lives of drudgery and poverty and hard work, and then they interact with Rhoda Nunn, who is this amazing, strong-willed female character who shows them that there is another way to look at things and another place for them in society, because even though they are single and they are odd women, as the title suggests, in the sense that they are uncoupled, they don't have prospects of marriage, they still can play a role in society.
But not everyone is as free-thinking and forward-thinking as Rhoda is, and they explore these really interesting tensions between society's expectations and Rhoda's radical new view on things. So one of the things I loved so much about this book was the different characters and how they were all portrayed. Some of them were complex and confusing. Some of them were a little more straightforward in their ideas, but I feel like each of the characters was a separate ideology or a separate way of thinking about gender and class. One of my favorites was Rhoda, who is just this strong character in so many ways. And I think in a lot of ways that actually rubs the reader the wrong way. I never really loved Rhoda, but I did love reading about her.
It's interesting because I think the first time I read it, I completely loved Rhoda. And this time I think I was a little bit more critical of her as a person, but I also still loved reading about her. Like, she's such a fascinating character. And I think as well, because she's this very feminist woman in the late Victorian period at a time where to be an independent and strong woman is hard and frowned upon. She sort of has to hold herself to her ideals even stricter. And she sort of has this, like, her ideals become quite complicated in her personality as well. I find it, so Rhoda runs a typewriting school with her friend Mary Barfoot, and they're both really interesting characters, but Mary Barfoot is a bit more sort of sympathetic to people in trouble than Rhoda is, and Rhoda sort of doesn't have that much time for people who don't live up to her ideals, especially other women who don't live up to her ideals, which is quite interesting as well.
Yeah, I think Rhoda represents this militant version of proto-feminism in a way where it's all or nothing for her, and she does get along with Mary, but they do have an interesting dynamic with each other, and the tension that they're both proto-feminists, they both run this school together, and yet they have so many differences and slight disagreements about the best way to pursue that, which is just really interesting to see because they're both on the same side, and yet even within proto-feminism there are so many varying views.
And as well, I think it's interesting that there's one moment in the book where there's like a big kind of feminist speech effectively, and it's given to Mary, not Rhoda, and Mary is kind of presenting this address to the other women that are in the typewriting school, and she's kind of talking about her ideals and what she hopes for the future, and the way in which women have been oppressed by society and by men for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I think it's interesting that it's Mary who has that speech, not Rhoda, because Rhoda's more of a main character in the book, but also because Rhoda on the surface seems like the more kind of militant, more impassioned one, but actually Mary also feels incredibly strongly about her ideals.
Yeah, and I think in that speech that you're talking about, it's a lot of Mary trying to show Rhoda that she is just as passionate as her in her own way, and that's why they do work so well together and are able to run this school together.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the other main characters is Monica, who is one of the sisters that the book partly focuses on. And she, at the beginning when we meet her, is working in a shop. So she was sort of born a lady. Her father was a doctor, but she's working in this shop. She's working kind of incredibly long hours in a really difficult situation, and she's very unhappy. And when she meets Rhoda again, who she hasn't seen for years, Rhoda tries to help her sort of improve herself. But Monica's quite a complicated character because she is kind of, I don't think she's as fully convinced by Rhoda's ideals as Rhoda is, but she also wants to be treated in a better way than society has treated her, I suppose.
Yeah, she's sort of in between Rhoda's ideals and a traditional woman in a lot of ways. And part of her journey in the book and part of her struggle is to sort that out. Does she want to be like Rhoda, or does she want to be something different altogether? Is she just striving to be the traditional woman and get married, have children, have a secure and satisfying life that way? Or will there be issues attaining that for her?
I suppose as well, Monica's two sisters, Alice and Virginia, both very clearly live an unhappy life. They're very, very poor. They're kind of moving from job to job, and every job is difficult for them. And they kind of spend a lot of time in the first few chapters working out sort of what's the minimum amount of money they could live on. They kind of just sort of eat plain rice and nothing else because they don't have the money for it. And that is sort of one depiction of what it means to be a single woman, especially a single sort of lower middle class woman in the Victorian period. And Rhoda is a very different picture. Rhoda and Mary are very different pictures of what it means to be a single woman in the Victorian period. And Monica sort of, I suppose, Monica doesn't know whether her life will be more likely to make her a Rhoda nun or like her sisters.
Yeah, and I think she is first and foremost scared of becoming her sisters because she sees their life and she sees that it is so oppressive and just a life that she doesn't want to live. And she's lucky that she's younger than all of these other characters. And so she has more time to figure these things out and to decide, where she wants to go in the world.
I suppose another really interesting thing the book looks at is sort of how limited women's opportunities are in terms of work at this point in time. Both Virginia and Alice has been a governess and Virginia has been a companion, basically. And those are like two of the only kind of options open for middle-class women for a lot of the Victorian period. If you were a lady and you wanted to earn a living for yourself, you had to teach or you had to sort of, be a companion or possibly a nurse. But because technology is changing in the Victorian period and typewriting is considered kind of acceptable for women, suddenly there's this new option. You could be a secretary, which is not something women had ever been able to do before. And Rhoda and Mary are kind of promoting that. And they're sort of like what single women do in the new age. And Alice and Virginia are much more what single middle-class women have been doing for decades before this point, I suppose.
Absolutely. And you don't think of the typewriter as being something particularly Victorian. I think we think of the typewriter as much more early, mid 20th century kind of thing, as opposed to the late Victorian period. But it was starting to become popular then. And yeah, I also think it's really interesting to think about their opportunities and all the different characters' opportunities with regards to class, because there is this really interesting class divide of the work. The jobs that you were mentioning that Alice and Virginia, the Madden sisters, have looked into for the most part have been genteel women's occupations and have been, like you said, for centuries. Maybe not centuries, but years at least. But it was possible to do other work at the time period. It just wasn't considered particularly genteel. And it's interesting that their younger sister is put into a profession that is a lot less genteel. She is a draper and she works in a shop. And because of that, she's exposed to a different class of people.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think as well, like Alice and Virginia are so poor and they sort of don't have any salary at all at the beginning and they're living off their kind of capital effectively. They'd probably be better off if they could get work in a factory. They'd probably be able to earn better wages. But because of their upbringing and their class, that would never be considered an option. Better to starve yourself and just live off plain rice and nothing else forever than to take a job that wasn't kind of suitable to your class. But obviously Monica does have this different job. And I wonder if that's partly, I suppose she's quite a bit younger. So, I mean, physically, I can't imagine that Alice or Virginia would be able to stand up in a shop all day. We're always given the impression that their health isn't great, whereas Monica is a bit more able to do that.
Yeah, and I do think also of the working class professions, working in a shop is a little more genteel, a little more upper class than factory work, certainly.
Yeah, and I think as well, working in a clothing shop is like a step above working in a few steps above working in like a butcher or a baker. Definitely would be considered a bit more fashionable. Certainly, I think a lot in the late Victorian period and early 20th century, there was a lot of call for basically clothes shops wanted the people, especially the women who worked there, to be pretty. So basically they sort of tried to recruit nice lady looking pretty women that they thought would appeal to the clientele who were shopping for things there. So I guess that's part of it as well. But Monica obviously works incredibly long hours and has a very, very much a drudgery life. I mean, as do Alice and Virginia when they're working too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like Monica could easily work herself to death in the shop. Something I was wondering about is where you think typewriting fits into the class order of jobs, because I think that for the most part it is genteel at the time, but we know as the years go on, typewriting becomes much more of a working class kind of profession.
I mean, by the late 19th century, literacy is much better than it was decades before, and there's been a lot more schooling, but still kind of being educated is a middle, having a proper long education is a middle class thing. So the ability to be able to type and to know all your letters and be able to write really well is still kind of considered a more middle class thing. So I think at this point in time, it is middle class, but it's lower middle class because it's clerical work and it's being a clerk, unless you were very senior in the Victorian period, you would have been lower middle class, you wouldn't have been that wealthy. But I guess the typewriter means suddenly there's female clerks as well and female secretaries that are suddenly considered able to do that work. It's interesting. I don't really know why Victorian society decided it was acceptable for women to be typists on the typewriter when they wouldn't have wanted them as clerks before. But it does seem to be the case that the invention of the typewriter suddenly was this massive new opportunity for women to go into the workplace basically and into office jobs effectively, which they'd never been able to before.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And I wonder if the female typewriters were of a higher class in general than the clerks were, than the male clerks.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, maybe actually, you might well be right.
Yeah, it just seems interesting. And then that just kind of shifts to a new kind of class perspective where the classes are intermingling a lot more.
Yeah. I think as well, it's interesting how gender and class affects you, because sort of for women in the Victorian period, your class was usually defined by either what your father's job had been or what his position inside society had been, or your husband's class. But for the women in this book, who are all single and also all orphans, their class is still partly determined by their upbringing and who their parents were, but it's also determined by what they're doing, which is not the experience of most women in the Victorian period, which is quite interesting, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely a different way of interpreting class for these women. And I think in another way that makes them odd as well, that not just that they're not coupled, but that their lineage isn't quite known to everyone. Look at the Maddens, for example. They moved to the big city after their father dies. They moved to London, and their experience there is obviously very different than their experience would have been if they stayed where they were born, where the entire town knows them and knows their background and their heritage and would view them as genteel. They moved to London and nobody really knows them, but they want to portray themselves as genteel.
It's interesting though that even though they seem a bit classless to us, they definitely don't think of themselves as classless. I think it's really interesting that Rhoda and Mary and one of the other women who comes to visit them have a discussion about sort of to what extent as women who want more rights for women, do they help people of other classes or not? And Rhoda is very dismissive of the idea that they should help working class women. And she sort of thinks that their brand of proto-feminism, I guess, or feminism is for educated middle class women, really, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And even though we see them as so classless and as the borders between class are shifting and changing, there is still a lot of class prejudice in the book and from the characters' points of view.
Yeah, and I do think it's something Gissing is a bit critical of. I did find it interesting on the Goodreads group, lots of people were saying they found the writing much more modern than they expect from a Victorian novel usually, which is interesting, which I don't think I'd really thought about, but I suppose it is like Gissing does have quite a more modern style, I suppose, in some ways.
Yeah, I guess he does. I think he does in the same way that Arthur Conan Doyle does in the Sherlock Holmes books, that it's a lot more readable to most people than some other Victorian books. And I wonder if it's just because of the late Victorian era is more readable than the earlier, but it does seem like something that a lot of people have noticed.
Yeah, I mean, Gissing's a similar time to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and I suppose like we always think, like I always know that I always think about the Victorian period as like the Victorian period, that's one thing, but actually it was a really long time. And the difference between like the 1840s and the 1890s, if you think how different like today is from 50 years ago, obviously a lot will have changed in the world and in literature. And Gissing has a more like pulled back writing style, I suppose, than some of the earlier Victorian writers. He's definitely less wordy than some of the others. And I really like his writing style. I think it's always quite clear, and I think his dialogue and his sort of characterization in general is really good. I definitely really like everything I've read by him so far. I think he's great.
Yeah, I mean, this is the only thing I've read by him so far, but I absolutely loved it. I didn't have any problems with the writing style. I definitely didn't find it too wordy, and I do think that his dialogue was so good. I think most of the things that I highlighted in the book were dialogue.
Yeah, I have so many tabs from all of the interesting stuff throughout it, because there's just a lot. Yeah.
I have to reread it when I get my copy back, my physical copy. I have so many highlighted sentences and things in the e-copy, but I'll have to transfer those into the physical form.
I think, so I've read 3 Gissing books, but of the 3 I've read, 2 of them I've read twice, which I think probably tells you how much I like his books. Like, I think he's very, very good.
I would read more Gissing. I think I should read more Gissing, in fact. Maybe during Victober.
Yeah. I would say I think The Odd Women is probably of the 3 I've read, it's the most optimistic, which maybe, I don't know, the other 2 I have read are quite depressing. But I think Gissing, a bit like Hardy, he does deal with a lot of like really hard-hitting themes and stuff. But The Odd Women, because it is so proto-feminist and it's full of such a like desire to change the world, I find that really hopeful. So that even if like some of these characters are going through really difficult stuff, they also believe that the world is going to be better in the future, and that's really nice.
Yeah, I don't think it's the most uplifting book I've ever read, of course, but I do think it is nothing like Jude the Obscure in depression levels or anything like that. It definitely has a theme of optimism and hopefulness in the book as well.
I highly recommend The Netherworld, but that's pretty miserable.
I'll probably still read it anyway, but I'll go into it knowing that it's miserable, so I know what to expect. Because I think if I went into The Odd Woman and did not know that it was going to be, well, I think if I thought it was going to be super positive and uplifting, and I went into it and read the first 2 chapters, I think I wouldn't have continued on, because the first 2 chapters of The Odd Woman can seem a little depressing. And I remember I even left you a little message afterwards saying, is this what the whole book is going to be like? And you were saying, no, it's not. It gets better. And it did. So
I think that's why I compare him to Hardy a lot, because Hardy can also be a bit gloomy, but in a great way. Yeah, I found it interesting rereading it because I didn't read it for the first time that long ago, and there were some scenes that had stuck in my head really, really, really thoroughly. And then there were other things that I kind of lost track of. There was a whole character I forgot, but
really?
There were other bits that had really, really stayed with me so much, which I find interesting. Yeah, I forgot Mr. Bevis, entirely forgot about his presence in the book, which is weird. Yeah,
that is weird.
But yeah, I think it's a really, really fantastic novel, and the bits that I remembered well were still bits that stuck out to me, like on a second reading. And I do think it was interesting to read it again and have like slightly different feelings. Like I think when I read it the first time, I enjoyed Rhoda's plotline much more than Monica's, and I think this time I probably got more out of Monica's than I had the first time. and also kind of, was just able to look a bit more closely at the kind of gender dynamics and the complications of the proto-feminism that like Rhoda and Mary are talking about. I think especially because the first time I read it, I didn't know much about it at all, and I didn't know that it was as feminist as it is, and I didn't know that it was as much about kind of women's right and gender as it is. And so actually it was a really like nice discovery, and therefore I don't think I like examined it analytically, I suppose, because I was just quite excited to find this. It wasn't really what I was expecting.
Yeah, and I mean, I went into it this time knowing that it was a bit proto-feminist and had a lot to say about gender and women's rights, but at the same time I was so swept away by the plot and eager to see what would happen that I think on a second read I would like to pay a lot more attention to those little nuances of gender and class that I may have missed on a first reading, because I was just so in suspense to see what would happen at the end.
Yeah, and it does have a lot of drama, because actually it's not that long a book, but a lot happens. And I think one of the reasons why there were like bits I forgot is because actually it's an awful lot to pack into one book. And I think Gissing does it really wonderfully and makes it so you do believe all of the character relationships and how they change, even though it happens, and the book spans a long period in time, but actually it's not that long, especially if you compare it to a lot of early Victorian novels. And a lot happens in it. And so it is very pacey, I think.
Yeah, I think it was just a wonderful book with a lot packed in terms of plot and character and theme, and the balance of those three things worked really well for me.
Yeah, I think it's thematically fascinating, but as well as that, it has a really good plot and the characters are really fantastically drawn and all feel really, really human as well. Like for a book that is all about ideals and ideas, I think it would have been very easy for all of the characters to be sort of representative of ideas, and they sort of are, but they're also really complicated and human in their own right, which I think is really good. And even the characters who are dislikable are also complicated, and we do see inside their heads as well, which I think is really good and really cleverly done.
Yeah, I think you can point to different characters as representative of specific ideals, but at the same time they also aren't in some ways, that you can look at each of them and point to a way in which they're different than that. And that's what makes the book really interesting and fun to talk about. So I think that's good for the spoiler-free version. I think I'm really eager to talk about some more spoilery things with regards to the characters and the ending, as I'm sure you are as well. So check out Katie's channel after this for the second part of this discussion, the spoilery version. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you in another video soon. Bye!